A small picturesque village, Horton, is nestled on the edge of a range of hills and grassy meadows predominant in the southwest of England. Most Britons wouldn't immediately find it on a map, but this was never a problem. On the contrary, the residents of Horton considered this their main advantage. So much so that any attempt to do something that would draw attention to the village was met with hostility. Therefore, when Horton made the headlines in the spring of 1984, no one was prepared for it. What made it worse was that the threat to their established way of life came not from outside, but from within. When this story took place, farms were the main source of income for the residents and the primary industry of Horton, if one could even say that about a village. In 1984, 250 people lived here, and these were typical farming families like the family of Graham and Margaret Backhouse, owners of a dairy farm. They were raising 2 young children and worked around the clock on 120 hectares of land together with several hired workers. On Tuesday, April 3rd, 1984, one of the farm workers was making his rounds when he came across a sight that shocked him. Hanging from one of the fence posts was a freshly severed sheep's head. Below it was a note, soaked with dripping blood, with only 2 words handwritten on it: "You next." However, when the farm owner, 43-year-old Graham Backhouse, was informed about the gruesome discovery, he wasn't even surprised. Moreover, he knew that the threat was directed at him. In the past few weeks, someone had unmistakably made it clear that they were conducting a personal vendetta against him. It all began in mid-March. The man was going through his mail when his eye caught a handwritten letter. It was addressed specifically to Graham, and it read, "I finally found you. You ruined my sister's life. Now you must pay." The sender didn't sign the letter or provide any additional details. Graham had no idea what it was about and simply threw the message away. But a few days later, the phone rang at his house. Graham answered. It was a man whose voice he didn't recognize. It seemed like the stranger was trying to mimic an Irish or Scottish accent. He threatened Graham with violence and hung up. The following week, he called again. As soon as Graham heard the man's voice, he realized it was the same anonymous person. This time, he threatened the man's family. His wife, 37-year-old Margaret, or Maggie, and their children, 8-year-old Harry and 6-year-old Sophie. Graham had to tell his wife about the letters and the call, but overall, he didn't want to scare her too much. However, when the stalker left the sheep's head and the unequivocal threat, he could no longer ignore the danger. Graham Backhouse contacted the police. Officers hooked up a recording device to the family's phone and interviewed them. But neither spouse knew what the anonymous person wanted or what ruined life of a sister he was referring to. They were ordinary farmers who had inherited the land from Graham's late father. His 70-year-old mother, Rita, lived in a small bungalow on the property nearby. Officially, she owned the farm, but was not of an age to work on it. Before that, Graham and Maggie had worked as a hairdresser and a hotel receptionist, respectively. Now they had to work hard, but village life seemed to suit the couple. They also had great relationships with other Horton residents. Maggie was loved and respected for her charitable work. She raised money for a children's aid fund. Graham also had many friends in the village. At least that was the case until they fell victim to the horrific campaign of letters and threatening calls. The police collected the evidence and looked around, but they couldn't find anything else. Anyone who might have been near the farm at the time was questioned, but no one saw anyone leave the note and the head. The police admitted their inability to do anything further. They promised to keep an eye on the farm, but advised Graham to try to secure his home by any means possible. About another week passed. On April 9th, Maggie needed to go to the veterinarian to pick up medicine for one of the cows. It was supposed to be a very quick trip, but unbeknownst to her, she fell into a cleverly set trap. At 8:20 a.m., Maggie left their 2-story yellow house and entered the barn where their cars were parked. She first headed towards her Fiat, but remembered it had some issues. So she approached the Volvo, which her husband usually drove. Maggie sat in the driver's seat and inserted the key into the ignition. Everything seemed normal, but the moment she turned the key, all hell broke loose. The silence was shattered by a terrible noise. The car windows exploded into tiny shards, and the pain was unbearable. Maggie didn't know it yet, but she had just triggered a bomb placed under the driver's seat. Although the explosion severely injured almost her entire lower body, she managed to crawl out of the car despite the pain. She then crawled along the driveway, calling for help. Maggie was able to attract the attention of a school bus driver. The driver rushed to her while a schoolgirl who knew the Backhouse family ran to get Graham, who was working in the milking parlor. When he heard that his wife was injured, he turned pale and began to shake. The man hurried into the house to call an ambulance and then brought a blanket for his wife. Soon, paramedics arrived and took the injured woman to the hospital, where she underwent a series of operations. The lead shot with which the bomb was packed had damaged her legs and lower back. The doctor removed at least half a kilogram of shot. She also had several skin grafts, but most importantly, she survived. Meanwhile, the police were working at the crime scene. Once the bomb squad confirmed there were no other explosive devices, the detectives were able to thoroughly examine the Volvo. They discovered that whoever had made the bomb had done so very crudely. The bomb consisted of a scaffolding pipe filled with 42,000 lead pellets and gunpowder from 12 shotgun cartridges. It was hidden under the driver's seat. It was inconspicuous, and Maggie didn't notice anything. If it had been placed anywhere else, it would have killed her. However, the floor of the Volvo was made of thin and flexible materials. The seat, on the other hand, was heavy and sturdy. It was very well made. The seat and the car floor absorbed most of the blast's power and directed the remaining pellets in other directions. Thus, the solid and sturdy construction of the seat acted as a kind of safety cocoon for Maggie. This saved her life. The police immediately doubted that Maggie was the target of the attack. Assuming that this was the work of the same person who had been sending threatening letters, investigators concluded that the perpetrator was hunting Graham, especially since it was Graham who usually drove the Volvo. This theory was confirmed when another letter from the anonymous sender was found later that day. The note hinted that the perpetrator had returned, but was scared off by the presence of the police. As always, there was no name or signature at the end of the letter. But the anonymous writer promised to see Graham again. This meant that whoever this person was, they were not done with their victim. It goes without saying that the news of the attack on Maggie spread like wildfire through Horton. While the villagers were relieved to hear that she survived the explosion, this did little to soothe their unease, especially as the details of the anonymous stalker's harassment of the family before the incident became known. For people who had always viewed outsiders as the primary threat to their way of life, accepting that the danger came from within was particularly difficult. While Maggie was recovering in the hospital, the rest of the family was under police protection. Officers interviewed nearly all the villagers, which, given the small size of the community, was not too difficult to accomplish. Detectives hoped that witnesses might provide leads, as they still had little to go on. The only evidence they had so far were the remnants of the explosive device and the 2 threatening letters left at the farm before and after the attack. Upon closer examination of the letters, the police noticed a mark on one of the notes that resembled an imprint from a pen or pencil used on another piece of paper lying on top of the note. The imprint was unique, resembling a meaningless pattern that someone might doodle absent-mindedly. This pattern could potentially aid in solving the case, but only once it could be compared to something else. The investigators also spoke with Graham again, hoping he could identify anyone who might have a grudge against him. Graham recalled having territorial disputes with his neighbor, Colin Bedale Taylor. The issue was that Colin's driveway ran alongside the back of Graham's farm, and Colin did not allow Graham to use it to access his field. While this was a significant issue, the police found it hard to believe that anyone would resort to planting bombs in cars over such a dispute. Graham then admitted something he had previously kept secret. Throughout his marriage, he had cheated on his wife numerous times. Most of these affairs were one-night stands, but there were also ongoing relationships. One of his mistresses was 24-year-old shepherdess Jillian, the daughter of a sheep farmer. Graham stated that he had no deep feelings for Jillian, but he was flattered by the attention from such a young woman. In addition to her, he had regularly seen the wife of his best friend, David Hodkinson. Upon hearing this confession, the detective speculated that someone connected to one of these women might have a motive to kill Graham. The detectives were confident they had found the perpetrator when they discovered that Graham's best friend, David Hodkinson, had once worked in a quarry where he used explosives. More intriguingly, David now worked with electronics and wiring in cars. Although there was no doubt that David had the expertise needed to create a bomb, a significant problem arose when the detectives dug deeper. At the time of the explosion, David was vacationing in Spain and had been out of the country for several days. As for the second woman, Jillian, she outright denied having an affair with the farmer. She claimed that Graham's accusations were a product of his imagination and described such behavior as beneath her. There was no evidence linking her or anyone associated with her to the crime. Consequently, the police found themselves at an impasse once again. 9 days later, while Maggie was recovering in the hospital and the couple's children were staying with their grandparents, Graham decided to end the constant surveillance of his home. The rationale was simple. Either the attacker would try again and they would finally discover his identity, or Graham and his family would be able to return to their normal lives. In any case, living under round-the-clock police watch had become unbearable. The detectives agreed with him but installed a panic button in the house, directly connected to the police station. This way, Graham could press it if anything happened, and the police would come to his aid immediately. Meanwhile, the detectives continued interviewing the residents of Horton. On the evening of April 30th, they spoke with Graham's neighbor, 63-year-old Colin Bedale Taylor, with whom he had had territorial disputes. Colin mentioned that he barely knew Graham and that their disputes were not particularly serious, though they sometimes escalated in tone. The detectives also wanted to speak with Colin's wife, Margaret, so Colin went outside to work in the garage. The investigators asked Margaret about 2 thefts from a shop for which her husband had been accused. This was apparently a surprise to her, as she was unaware of these accusations. She said that after the tragic death of their youngest son 2 years prior, Colin had been troubled, but he had been seeing a psychotherapist and was getting better. At that moment, Colin peeked into the house and said he would visit the neighbor. For some reason, neither his wife nor the detectives paid much attention to his comment. As the sun was setting, Colin walked a few hundred meters to Graham Backhouse's farm. Everything was quiet. The workers had left, and the police officers guarding the house were gone. Lights were on inside, and Colin knocked on the door. Within about 10 minutes, the sharp wail of a siren cut through the air. On April 30th at 8:25 p.m., the residents of Horton watched in horror as police cars with sirens blaring raced down the main road. There was a meeting at the municipal building that evening, and the atmosphere among the attendees immediately changed. Many sat helplessly, watching the police cars pass by. Those who found their voices expressed hope that the police were not headed back to Graham's farm. Although no one wanted to believe it, that was indeed where they were headed. The officers arrived to a scene that everyone had feared might eventually occur. The entire kitchen floor of the Backhouse home was covered in blood droplets. Chairs and furniture were overturned, suggesting a struggle had taken place. The homeowner, Graham, was alive but had sustained 2 deep and long cuts that bled profusely. The first cut started at the upper part of his chest, ran diagonally, and partially encircled the lower part of his torso. The second wound began on the left side of his face near the ear and extended down below his lip. Another man lay on the floor at the foot of the stairs at the end of the hallway. In his right hand, he held a knife, and there were 2 gunshot wounds in his chest. He was dead. The deceased was identified as 63-year-old Colin Bedale Taylor. Medics rushed Graham to the hospital, where he received more than 50 stitches. The doctor mentioned that the noticeable scars would remain with him for the rest of his life. After receiving medical attention, Graham recounted what had happened. He had met with his neighbor Colin at Colin's request. Colin, known in town as a jack-of-all-trades, came under the pretext of looking at some furniture, but behaved oddly. Appearing nervous, Colin began accusing Graham of crazy things, including the death of his 19-year-old son 2 years ago. Graham, of course, reminded his neighbor that his son had died in a car accident, but Colin seemed to have lost his mind. He confessed to planting the bomb in Graham's Volvo, nearly killing Maggie, and admitted to being behind the threatening letters and phone calls. Colin then suddenly declared that he had been led there by Providence and that Graham must die because it was God's will. With these words, he pulled out a utility knife. He managed to inflict 2 deep cuts on Graham before Graham reached the place where he kept his gun. Graham fired twice, killing Colin. He then pressed the panic button. For the local residents, the news of the second incident at the farm was simply unbearable, especially after the media began to savor the details of Colin's involvement in both crimes. Although he had a reputation as a somewhat eccentric person, no one could have imagined he was capable of something like this. He and his wife Margaret had lived in Horton for over 20 years, raised 4 children there, and were very sociable. Throughout all that time, their acquaintances had not noticed a single warning sign. Yet, the more details that emerged, the more people began to doubt. It turned out that Colin's initials were scratched on the knife he used during the attack, and when a search was conducted at his house, a piece of pipe was found lying in the yard, similar to the one used to make the bomb. The pipe had been cut at the same angle as the piece of the explosive device found at the crime scene. The death of the couple's youngest son, Digby, 2 years ago had hit Colin hard. Digby had been in the car with his friend Denzel. Denzel was driving. He survived, but Digby did not. Denzel was charged with reckless driving but was acquitted. It was very difficult for Colin to accept this. He had been treated for depression after being insistently asked to retire early from his job as an engineer. Colin's condition worsened every time he saw Denzel, who, incidentally, had been hired to work at Graham Backhouse's farm. Considering Colin's disputes with Graham over the territory, people began to wonder, could all of this have driven Colin over the edge? For about 2 weeks, rumors and suspicions gained momentum before the final shocking event followed. On the evening of May 12, 1984, the police arrived at the farm for the last time. This time, they were not responding to an incident, but to arrest the person truly responsible for the horrible events that had taken place there until that moment. That person was Graham Backhouse. Graham's nefarious plan had roots going back to November 1983, when his accountant warned him about his dire financial situation. His father had been an excellent farmer and businessman, but the same could not be said about Graham. He had tried not only to keep dairy cows, but also to grow crops. However, 2 consecutive years of poor harvests had hit him especially hard. When he met with his accountant, he stated that he wanted to transition completely from crop farming to livestock farming, but he was told that he owed more than £50,000 and couldn't afford another loan. To buy cows and cover additional expenses, he would need twice that amount. Graham tried to raise money by selling part of his land. However, he managed to sell only a few small plots. By the spring of 1984, his debts had exceeded £70,000. At that point, Graham decided he would get the money by any means necessary. Each spouse had a life insurance policy worth £50,000, but in March 1984, Graham doubled the amount of the insurance policy, so that in the event of his wife's death, he would receive £100,000. Just a few days later, he began setting the stage for a campaign of terror against himself and his family. However, the anonymous letters did not attract police attention. Then he raised the stakes. He placed the sheep's head in the note reading, "You're next." Deciding that the officers were sufficiently convinced by the threats he had fabricated, he moved on to the main part of his plan. He cut a piece of pipe, filled it with lead shot and gunpowder, and then on April 9th, placed the homemade bomb in his own car. He made sure to disable his wife's car as well. Fortunately, Graham lacked sufficient knowledge and experience in making explosive devices. Additionally, he underestimated the build quality of his car. As a result, the bomb did not kill his wife. Although this dashed Graham's dreams of obtaining £100,000, he quickly realized that he had created much bigger and more immediate problems. The police were investigating the attempt on Maggie's life, and they could trace it back to him. Initially, he wanted to blame his friend David Hodkinson. David could have been an excellent scapegoat due to Graham's affair with his wife and David's experience with electronics and explosives. However, he failed to lure David to his home after the explosion. Graham had to change his plans and shifted his focus to Colin. Graham asked Colin to come over and look at some furniture he supposedly planned to restore, but he simply shot the unsuspecting man. Colin just wanted to help his neighbor and possibly earn some money, and he walked right into the lion's den. The detectives knew exactly when Colin left his house, and that the men wouldn't have had time to exchange more than a few words. Colin barely had time to enter the house before he was shot twice in the chest. Graham then staged the scene to make it look like he had been attacked. His elaborate setup included deep cuts on his face and chest to make it easier for the police to believe his claims of self-defense. He carved Colin's initials on the knife he used to cut himself before placing it in Colin's hand and left a piece of pipe on Colin's property. In other words, he nearly killed his wife and then murdered an innocent neighbor, all for the £100,000 insurance money, which he knew he would never receive even before killing Colin. Certainly, these weren't just speculations of the police and prosecution. By the time the trial began, they had amassed a wealth of evidence proving Graham's guilt. Many of these pieces were circumstantial, but there were so many that they couldn't be denied. First of all, There were documents confirming Graham's dire financial situation and the fact that he had increased the insurance payout in case of his wife's death just days before his first report to the police. There were also notes written on paper from the Backhouse family home, proven by the imprint of a doodle found on a piece of paper in a notebook that matched the imprint on the note. Then there was the blood at the shooting scene. Although Graham claimed that Colin chased him through the house, all the blood drops on the kitchen floor were round and even, indicating that the injured person was standing still, not running. Similarly, while Graham claimed that Colin cut him before he managed to grab a weapon, there was no blood on the weapon. His injuries did not match the statements he gave to the police. Experts concluded that such a cut on Graham's body could have been inflicted by another person only if they grabbed Graham from behind. But Graham insisted that Colin attacked him while they were face to face. Even if he lied about this, experts stated that there were other features of the wounds indicating that he inflicted them on himself. If Graham had really been attacked, he would have instinctively leaned away, but there were no defensive wounds on him. The depth of the cuts suggested someone confidently turning the knife towards himself. Additionally, Graham shouldn't have placed the knife in Colin's hand because, after 2 shotgun blasts to the chest, he would have certainly dropped it. Even the so-called initials of Colin on the knife supported the prosecution's case, rather than the defense. Colin's family and friends said he was very meticulous with tools and would never do such a thing. He had 500 tools at home, and none of them had initials on them. The planted piece of pipe didn't fool investigators either. The grass under the pipe was not withered and hadn't even been pressed by its weight, indicating that it had been placed there just a day before it was found. Why would Colin move it 3 weeks after the explosion to a place where it could be easily found? Investigators immediately suspected that Colin was being framed. This conclusion was confirmed when one of Graham's workers told the police that a few days before the explosion, he heard noise in one of the farm sheds. There should have been no one there, so the worker went to investigate and found Graham cutting a pipe. Finally, the schoolgirl who ran to Graham after the Volvo explosion did not tell him what had happened to Maggie, only that she was injured. Graham couldn't have heard the explosion while he was in the milking parlor, yet when he called the ambulance, he reported that his wife had been injured in an explosion. Despite all the evidence, Graham maintained that he was not responsible for what had happened. He insisted on his innocence, even when the police intercepted 2 letters he had secretly sent from prison. In one letter, he begged his wife to help him fabricate new evidence against Colin. However, Maggie handed her husband's letter over to the police. The second letter was addressed to a newspaper, where someone clumsily tried to cast doubt on Colin. But of course, thanks to Maggie, the police immediately realized that Graham was the real author of the letter. On February 18, 1985, Graham Backhouse was found guilty of murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 2 life terms. Unfortunately, the life of one of his victims, Maggie, did not get easier after his arrest. She had to engage in a legal battle over the fate of the farm. Maggie managed the farm for 10 months from the time of her husband's arrest until his conviction. However, after the sentencing, the property was placed in a trust. Although she wanted to stay on the farm, which she and the children considered home, it was sold within a few months and they had to move out. The dairy farm was converted into stables for horses. The divorce was finalized in the spring of 1986. Graham died of a heart attack while playing cricket in prison in 1994 at the age of 53, having served 10 years. A year later, 48-year-old Maggie died of cancer. One cannot help but agree with the judge who, when sentencing Graham Backhouse, said, "Not satisfied with failing to kill your wife, who by your own account loved you and had done you no wrong, you cold-bloodedly killed a neighbor who had harmed you not at all and whom you hardly knew." The local residents vowed never to forget Colin, but they remembered him not as a murder victim, but as a man who dedicated many years of his life and work for the benefit of Horton.